So, ladies and gentlemen, you have had time to discuss a little bit with your group. I'd like to know, which did you think was the most important element of the preamble? What was the most important purpose of our Constitution? Hope? Why? Why'd you pick that one? Okay. Now, we want to understand, we want to think about why is this the most important to us as an individual? Not necessarily to our nation, but to you as an individual. I mean, the Constitution belongs to all of us, right? I know you weren't there to write and throw your opinion in there. But why is this most important to you? So for Hope, she believes that that's important for her. You may have a different argument. So I want to hear your argument. Not that any of you are right or wrong. I mean, all 6 of these are really good. So somebody else. Why is this important to you? The country in which you live. Chance?
Establishing justice.
Why?
Because without it, you just have people like chaos.
Yeah? So are you also in favor of rules here at school? Yeah. Because we need justice. We need to have order. Otherwise it'd be chaos. So I think that's a really good one as well. What else? Somebody else. Maybe you have one of the same ones and you have a different reason why. I want to hear why you chose that one as your most important. No?
So you asked which one of these was best for us
Mhm.
specifically. But the way I see it is if the entire nation is better as a whole, then it also benefits you.
Okay.
So I thought that ensuring domestic tranquility was a good one because, especially right now in the United States, there's so much division
Yeah.
between different people groups.
Yeah.
And I think if everyone can agree and can be sort of peace instead of just fighting between
Mhm.
one and another state, then it will be better for you specifically. There won't be all kinds of things going on.
Yeah. I think it's really good that you brought up the idea of domestic tranquility, especially in the day in which we live. Is it the government's job then to make that happen? Whose job is it? I heard somebody whisper it. The people. Okay, first 3 words of the preamble, we the people. Now we are setting up a government through this Constitution, but it's the people's responsibility. But yet when we see all the violence going on, what is the outcry from the masses of people? Who's supposed to fix this? Government. And it's a lack of understanding where the government gains its power. It comes from the people, so we have to make the decisions to provide a more peaceful environment to allow our government to work and operate. Now, on the flip side, it's also government's responsibility to make sure that they're not doing things that are going to promote chaos and disorder. So that is also part of the argument. Somebody else. Dave?
I chose this to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity.
Okay.
Because I felt like the blessings of liberty could kind of encompass some of the others. Like, if you're seeking to ensure the blessings of liberty for your generation and also future generations, you're going to have to put into place is justice, domestic tranquility, and the general welfare in order to have that.
Okay, that's a very good point. Good argument there. What I want you to see and what I want you to understand here is that there's really no right or wrong answer here. That we all have different reasons for why this is important to us. but it's important for you to have a reason and to be able to say, this is important to me because, and fill in the blank. And so when we look at the preamble of the Constitution, there are these 6 purposes for our government as it was set up. And excuse me, you identified those 6 within your group or on your own. And I want us to make sure that we get an understanding of where they are located and why they're put in here. So first of all, form a more perfect union. We still see? Okay. That helps a little bit, I think. So, to form a more perfect union, that was one of the reasons in which we established our Constitution. And the United States came from a previous government before the Constitution. What was the name of that government? Somebody else besides David. I've heard from you already today. Somebody I've not heard from yet. What did you study in U.S. history? What came before the Constitution? Articles of Confederation. Okay. So, under the Articles of Confederation, what was the main weakness there? Why was that not a good government for us? David?
The federal government did not have enough power over the states to tax.
So the federal government was weak. So when the United States Constitution is put together, that is the reason why they wanted the Constitution, to have a more perfect union, understanding that it's never going to be completely fixed. We're all sinful creatures. But it was going to be better than what they had with the Articles of Confederation. And so we were promoting the belief that in order to be a strong union, we had to have a stronger centralized government here with the Constitution. Now, in addition to that, they also formed this to establish justice. And a couple of you chose that as your most important. So what's the difficulty here with this term of justice? What is justice? Okay, what's the go ahead. What's the difficulty?
Well, like, but someone should deserve almost so one person can be different.
Okay, situations can adjust things, sure. How do we define justice? Or how do we know when somebody has received justice for their actions?
They have been guilty from if they're like talking from a court standpoint, like when they go to court and they get judged, like the judge says, like, oh, you get justice for this how many sins for how many years. They can do it often like they're guilty or not guilty.
Okay, so we look at guilt or innocence to determine justice, but by what standard do we measure whether they should be guilty? Come on.
By a specific law, either man-made or...
Okay. Okay, so there needs to be a law established, and you said either a man-made law or a biblical law. So we have to have a standard by which we define and establish justice. So in the United States, what is our standard for justice? Okay, so under what standard do we have to write all of our existing laws? The Constitution, okay? So every law has to fall under the guidelines of the Constitution. That is our standard. So what happens if we change the Constitution? Does the standard change? Yeah. What happens if our viewpoints change on how we interpret the Constitution? Does then our standard change? Yes. And this is where things have become difficult in the last 100 years or so. As people's viewpoints have changed and their personal philosophies have drifted further away from God's standard of justice, where it was at one point in our country where judges would look at the Constitution and they would look at it through a biblical or a moral perspective that was closely aligned to God's standard of righteousness, to now they have drifted away from that and they have compared the Constitution to the level of morality and the standard of righteousness that man says is acceptable. And so if you are going to offend somebody, well, that's not right. And so you need to back off on that if that's going to be offensive. So establishing justice is really difficult because everybody has a different idea of what justice ought to be. For many of us, we would align it with biblical truth. Other people would say it's society's viewpoint. And so there's a lot of different approaches to that, and it can be at times unfair, and it can be also very divisive. Thirdly, we've got ensure domestic tranquility. So the government is attempting to give us peace at home by controlling our behavior through a system of laws and a system of rules that would apply to us. And maintaining peace and order is important. What is the opposite of order in government? Anarchy. So anarchy is the absence of government. There's no peace, there's no order. And so if our rules fall apart, we will certainly end up with anarchy. So that is part of what the government is trying to accomplish for us. This should be Thomas Hobbes. I have a typo in there. He says, hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, that they are in a condition which is called war. And such a war, as is of every man against every man, in such a condition there is no place for industry, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. In the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, in short. Those are encouraging words, aren't they? This is what life looks like in anarchy and in constant war. And without the assistance of government to help us ensure that domestic tranquility. Now, we also have the common defense. This one is pretty simple and self-explanatory. They're going to defend us from enemies outside of our borders, from outside attacks. The government is also going to protect us from within any sort of attack, militarily or diplomatically. We have all kinds of agencies looking over our shoulder, trying to help us with that. And then, fifth, we have the promote the general welfare. And this is where the government is going to step in, and they're going to do things that will help our nation advance or to benefit the entire society. And there is often a lot of debate, as I'm sure that you discussed in U.S. history, with the actions that President Roosevelt took in the Great Depression as far as, is that constitutional? And he went here and he said, well, it's part of the general welfare. And let me also throw this in there, that the preamble to the Constitution is not, it is meant as an introduction, it's a purpose statement. Laws really should not be based upon the preamble, although many times they are often interpreted through it. So promoting general welfare is pretty broad as one of the government's responsibilities, but the government really should be a method of last resort to step in and to fix a situation like that. And then lastly, secure the blessings of liberty. As we talk about the blessings of liberty here, we are talking about individual rights, freedoms. Something like the Bill of Rights would be outlined in this heading. So we'll talk about the Bill of Rights a little bit later on in the semester. So government exercises certain freedoms, but it also limits freedoms. So you have the freedom to speak your mind. You have the freedom of speech according to the First Amendment. But does that freedom of speech guarantee you can say anything that you want? No. If you were at a concert or you're in a crowded movie theater and you yell fire, and there's no fire, and you're like, oh, hey, just kidding, or April Fools, they are most likely going to prosecute you for that. And even though you may say, well, it's my freedom to yell that, yes, it is, but we also are endangering others, and so we cannot do that. So there are times where your freedom of speech, your freedoms can be limited by the government. So other states have various purposes for their governments and for their constitution. And because we are so strongly embracing the social contract idea, this falls in line with our purpose for our government. Other nations may not have all 6 of these. They may only have 1 or 2. They may not have any of them. But we are talking about the United States here, and need to make sure that we understand that. Now, let's move on here to section 2. And some of you may have noticed I did go ahead and put up the slides on Canvas if you are interested in having those and going back and reviewing them. I'm also putting together the audio recording of our class, and so you can access that if you miss a day of class or if you miss something and you need to go back and review it, then those are on Canvas as well. I don't think it's recording any of you, but I'm not sure. So any of your responses and stuff, I'm not sure you can hear yourself. I'll have to go back and check and see. So let's go through these forms of government here. And we're looking here at the idea of who can participate in each type of government. We begin with democracy. So no 2 forms of government have ever been alike. We've had some similarities in government styles and government organizations, but every government is set up in their own way. So while we say that the United States has some similarities to democracy in Athens or democracy in Rome or the Republic of Rome, we made ourselves a little bit different, and we set ourselves up in our own way. But when you look at democracy, we said that the people have a say in democracy. They are part of the government. The power resides in the people. It's a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that is the key element in the idea of democracy. Now, within democracy, there are two main types. And these are not going to show up on the screen, so you need to make sure that you include these in your notes. The first type is a direct democracy, or sometimes called a pure democracy. I think you should have read about this in chapter 1. Can anybody remember what is direct democracy? Or give me an example of what it might look like. So how many of you read the chapter? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you turned your homework in? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you are planning on doing your homework over the weekend for chapter 2? Okay. How many of you are planning to eat lunch today? How many of you would like to end the school day right now? Okay. You have all just participated in a direct democracy. There is a question, there is a vote, you vote on everything. So you make every decision by a mass vote, and the majority wins in a direct democracy. So my wife used to watch this show. I'm not sure she's watched it in a long time. Probably more girls would be familiar with this than guys, but any of you familiar with Gilmore Girls? Okay. So none of the guys want to admit it, but some of them may know. So yes, I've watched that show with my wife, and so they have these town hall meetings, and this the small town has these town gatherings, and they all vote. That is the idea of direct democracy. They vote on every little thing. We rarely see this in any government today. A true, pure, direct democracy can't function very efficiently. And so even in the city of Lafayette, we don't have a direct democracy because there's no way we could make that all work. Now, the other type of democracy is an indirect democracy. So if a direct democracy, everybody votes on every issue, how do you suppose an indirect democracy works? What are you going to say? Okay, you're going to have one person. We need to add a little bit more to that. What else?
The people vote on someone to represent
Yes. So you're going to have a representative. So you're going to have one person who goes to vote on your behalf. And so all of us in this room would elect somebody to be our voter. And that person would then go vote on all the issues. And so that is an indirect democracy. So you vote once in November, and that person then takes care of all the decisions later on. And so what happens if you don't like what they do? Yeah, you got to wait till next election. Well, maybe. What else can you do if you don't like the way that your representative is voting? You can remove them. Yeah, you can, depending on the rules of that particular office, sometimes they can be recalled, sometimes they can be voted out of office. So that's the idea of democracy. In a dictatorship, this is a government of the government, by the government, and for the government. It's all about the state. It's all about the government. So most of us would associate a dictatorship with one person or maybe a small group of people that they lead the nation, they make all the decisions. So the people don't get a whole lot of decision in a dictatorship. What do we call a government led by one person in a dictatorship? An autocracy, okay? Auto, like your car, autocracy, C-R-A-C-Y. Okay, autocracy is one person has unlimited power. Nobody else checking his authority, nobody else has an opinion, has a say in what goes on. So let's contrast that with a group of people. If we have several that are part of this dictatorship, we are going to have an oligarchy. O-L-I-G-A-R-C-H-Y. So an oligarchy is a group of people. And they are the ones that make all the decisions for the nation. A lot of times dictatorships are militaristic. A lot of times they will have fake elections where they give the people an opportunity to vote, but there's only one person on the ballot. Or only one political party on the ballot. So you get to go vote. Congratulations. Check here. Not your only option. Now, when it comes to distribution of power, there are three ways that the power can be divided up. The first one is through a unitary government. So this would be also known as a centralized government where all of the power rests in one organization, one central agency. Hence the name UNA, or the prefix UNA in front of unitary. So all the government powers belong in a single central agency. Most of our world's governments are unitary. Most of the governments in our world are unitary. All of our 50 states in the United States are unitary governments. Our federal government is not. Our national government is not unitary. Anybody know what our national government is? Federal. Yeah, I gave it away a little bit ago. It is a federal government because it does not rest in a central single agency. So in a federal government, we have the powers divided between central and local governments. The powers of government are divided between central and local governments. And typically they are divided on a geographical basis. So for us, we have the 50 states, our geographic divisions. And it's our United States Constitution that established us as a federal government, as it divided our powers between the national level and the state level. So when it comes to changing our Constitution, our federal government has to change it in unison. They have to work together. So our states have to work alongside of the national government in order to change our Constitution. You cannot have the president change the Constitution by himself. You cannot have the Supreme Court change it by themselves. It has to be a collection of our House of Representatives, our states, and our central government. So they have to work together in order for that to happen. The third geographic distribution of power is Confederacy or Confederate government. How well does the Confederate government work? Not well. We have not seen this become successful in any sort of example in history. The Confederate States of America were an example of a confederation where the individual states or geographical regions hold more power than the national government. So the United States Confederacy was an example of that. Also, the Articles of Confederation in the early United States was another example of that, and both were terrible failures. I often wonder, because I lived and taught in the South for 10 years, and there was a different perspective of the Civil War down there. And I often wonder what might have happened had the South not been a confederacy. What if they would have been a different type of government, whether it's a dictatorship or if they would have been a federal government or something to that effect. I know that goes against everything and every reason why they became the Confederate States of America and why they left the United States. They wanted their own separate state power. But I wonder if they would have been a little more unified and could have held off the North a little bit longer. Who knows? So in the Confederacy, the central government is very weak and the regional government is very strong. But they don't work well together. There's a couple different approaches that you can take when it comes to relating the legislative and executive branches together. You can come with a presidential point of view or presidential system. And so in a presidential system, you are going to entirely separate the legislative and executive branch. The president is not allowed to make laws. He can suggest legislation to Congress, but he cannot write laws and get them passed into the government. But they are both equal in what they do, and they both have important parts of that, and they participate well in that. And they both have the power to check the other, or to stop the other. If one starts to get out of control, the other one can step up, and there are safeguards to make sure that neither the legislative or the executive becomes too powerful. That is one of the weaknesses of our federal government. While it is maybe a strength of keeping our powers separate, the power to stop the other often results in gridlock, where nobody can get anything done. And that can be extremely frustrating. The parliamentary government, this is a combined executive and legislative branch. So instead of keeping them separate, Parliament is going to merge them together, and they are all going to work for the same purpose and the same goals, and they all intermingle with one another. So the power of the executive branch in a parliamentary system is held by the Prime Minister. I don't think that's not going to show up on the screen, but you need to make sure that you include that. So Prime Minister is the executive, and he's the one that uses those executive powers. And he is elected by the Parliament members. So in this group right here, let's say that we're going to be Parliament. And real quick, I need the ladies to raise your hand for me so I can get a quick count. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13. And so then we have exactly 13 of each. 13 guys and 13 girls. So if we were to come up with an election, it would be really tough for us to elect a prime minister out of this group. Why? Because why? Yeah, the exact same number. So if we were to imagine, for the sake of this example, that your gender reflects your political party, we're going to be at a stalemate. This is part of the reason why we generally don't have an even number in Parliament. So I'm going to break the tie. I'm going to come in and I'm going to serve as the 14th member of the Gentleman's Party. And so we're going to come up with a vote, and if we are going to vote straight party lines, the ladies, you'll put up your strongest candidate, and guys, you will also put up your strongest candidate. And if we vote straight party lines, who wins? The guys. Okay, so the guys get to elect the prime minister. Now, if a couple of guys changed their vote and decided they wanted to vote for one of the ladies, they are allowed to. And so, while it is extremely rare, Parliament could elect somebody from a different party as the prime minister. But if they do that, they're never going to get anything done. Because when it comes to voting on policies and voting on laws, they're not going to come to any agreements. You need to have a majority in Parliament. They will vote their guy or their girl in, and that prime minister will work alongside with that majority. So you rarely will have a parliament and a prime minister that are not on the same page. Does that make sense? Okay. I see some of you shaking your heads. Is there anybody that's confused on a parliament system? Okay. So the prime minister comes from the majority party in the parliament almost every single time.